The next part will be a panel around Tim's paper, Economic Limits to Permissionless Consensus. So we have here Katrin Tinn and Katya Malinova, well, representing Canada. Katrin is a professor of finance at McGill University and in Montreal, and Katya is professor of finance in McMaster University in Toronto. And Tim came all the way from across the street, computer science department here at Columbia. So the kind of in terms of logistics, I will provide a little bit of context background, and I'm Hanna Halaburda from NYU, all the way from East Village, and then Tim is going to present a little bit of his paper, not too long of a presentation, and then we'll have Katrin and Katya and me discussing it together with you. So hopefully this will be fun. I mean, it's pretty novel format. I decided there goes my timer. So somebody time me, please. And I hope that we'll have also time for questions from the audience. So we'll see how it goes. I have been on panels before. I have moderated panels before. I have been on in sessions with papers and discussants, but having a paper and discussant panel session is kind of a different combination. But I'm sure it will be fun. So in terms of a background, going back to 2008, when Bitcoin came to being, or early 2009, depending how you want to count it, it combined elements that were all known in computer science, but it combined it in a novel way that showed that permissionless, distributed, decentralized system resistant to double spending is feasible. And therefore, we can have decentralized digital money, which we did not have before. And that was great. And many people said, how is it different from distributed databases that were around since the 1970s? And the main difference, as I see it, is in distributed databases, the nodes are doing what they are told unless they crash or they are hijacked. In blockchains that came from this Bitcoin's protocol, every node is off for themselves, payoff maximizing, which means that even in the best case, when they're not hijacked and they are not failing, they do whatever they want. And that means that the blockchain system needs to provide incentives for good behavior. So suddenly blockchains are distributed databases that start to think about the carrots and sticks of economics in order to provide incentives for good behavior, punishment for bad behavior. Now, this is especially difficult in an environment that is permissionless because it's anonymous. So how are we going to punish bad actors when we don't know who they are and reward good actors if we don't know who they are? Bitcoin solved it with proof of work. So everybody pays the cost upfront in terms of mining. Good actors get rewarded in terms of new Bitcoin. Bad actors get not rewarded, so they get stuck with the cost. It is a very costly system, right? It's a very costly system. And it has been under criticism, the electricity consumption, this is the cost of the system. So since then, we had seen a lot of new models, new mechanisms, new consensus mechanisms with new incentive systems being developed. And we have seen a lot of evolution, putting new elements that are going to provide the carrots and sticks in a more efficient way. So that the cost of the incentives, cost of the security that is borne by the system is lower, and preferably it's not borne by the whole system, but just by the bad actors. So we have delays in withdrawal of funds. This goes back to even Bitcoin. You need to wait 100 blocks before you can actually start spending your block reward. We have staking. and initial staking did not have slashing. So now we also have slashing in staking. And then on top of that, we may have a minimum amount of slashing, which is also one of those mechanisms to change the cost benefit analysis of attacks. So I hope that this kind of provides enough of a background for Tim to present his new findings about the limits to the permissionless consensus and how costly, how much cost we can put on the system to prevent double spending.
Thanks very much, Hanna. Really great contextual comments. Totally agree with everything you said. Actually, if you only remember one thing about this presentation, I want you to remember I have two great co-authors who haven't been mentioned yet. So Eric Budish and Andy Lewis-Pye. One of them's an economist, one of them's a mathematician. You'd think the economist would be the one whose affiliation includes the word economics, but then you think again, you're like, no, it's got to be the guy with the tie. And as you all know, that is Eric. And then, yeah, Andy's at LSE. So this work had sort of a few starting points, but one way to tell the story would be if you just go to Ethereum's official documentation right now, or if you look at sort of all of the framing around the merge that happened in 2022, they say, look, we're going to move from proof of work to proof of stake. They made a lot of other changes at the same time, but in particular, they're going to move from proof of work to proof of stake. Sybil resistance, and even right now in the documentation, they say there's three reasons we're going to do that, or that we did that. Security, sustainability, and scalability. Okay, so like sustainability, the middle one, that was the sort of energy usage of proof of work that Hanna alluded to. But the first of the three that they mentioned is security, more security from proof of stake than proof of work. And so the question is that actually, first of all, like, what does that even mean? Especially one often uses the phrase like crypto economic security. Like, what does that even mean? And secondly, like, is that actually true? Like, could we have a plausible model, and in that model, a mathematical theorem asserting that, in fact, yes, proof of stake is in some sense more secure than proof of work? And I think, at a high level, once you're thinking about proof of stake and slashing, there's some pretty clear intuition. You're just sort of sitting in your armchair thinking about it, right? Like, okay, so if you identify some people that are trying to attack your proof of work blockchain protocol, right? They've got all these ASICs, right? They've done a double spend, they've done whatever they do, maybe even like know who they are. Like, what's the protocol? What can it do, right? It can't like reach some imaginary arm across the world and confiscate ASICs away from some bad miner, right? Whereas in a proof of stake protocol, where your power over the protocol stems from currency you have locked up in a designated staking contract that the blockchain protocol itself controls, well, now all of a sudden it's quite plausible that perhaps the protocol could programmatically confiscate stake from sort of anyone it could identify as launching the account. Right? So that's been the high-level intuition that's been there, as far as I can tell, since basically 2014. But really, until this work, as far as we know, there was no real formalization of like, what would a provable slashing guarantee mean? What would sort of provable improvement over proof of work mean? And that's sort of the goal of this paper. So the paper has three results, which I'll just talk through. I should say I've kept this presentation super short. There's 3 slides. I just wanted to maximize time for questions from the panel and from the audience. Lots of stuff I could say about the paper. I wanted to sort of know what the audience is most interested in. The paper has 3 results. I'll give you a brief sort of high-level overview on the next slide of what they are. 2 of them are negative results, which says that if your assumptions are too weak, then you actually can't get what you want. You can't achieve the goals of slashing in a proof of stake protocol, for example. And then there'll be a third positive result, which says that under a stronger set of assumptions, you provably can. Okay? So to state any of those 3 results, I need a new definition, which is what property it is we want a protocol to satisfy. Okay? So that's the first contribution to the paper, is this notion of an EAC protocol. So here, EAC is an acronym for expensive to attack in the absence of collapse. And the collapse here is referring to a possible price collapse of the protocol's token, right? The sort of age-old argument dating back to Nakamoto would be that you might expect that people, even if they're in a position to attack, they're not going to, because the token price will collapse and they'll lose a bunch of stuff. We want to say that we don't want to use that as a crutch for the security of a blockchain protocol. We want to say even if the token price stays basically exactly the same, attackers are still going to be sort of harmed. Okay? That's what the absence of collapse means. Getting this right is actually very delicate, and a fair amount of work went into the paper and the precise definition. For today, just the intuitive description is, it should be the case that, first of all, if you just run the protocol honestly, like you just really just sort of run the default client all the time without any errors, you will never lose any resources. Like, for example, you'll never be slashed, no matter what else is going on. Second of all, if there's a successful attack, and here by attack, I mean, think about a double spend. So by attack, I mean a violation of the consistency of the blockchain protocol. Okay, so I mean that because two nodes wind up disagreeing on the finalized transactions, some of the supposedly finalized transactions have to get rolled back. That's what I mean by a successful attack. So the second part of the definition says, if there's a successful attack, then the attacker should be guaranteed to lose resources. Okay, meaning they, for example, they have some of their state slashed. Okay, so a protocol will be EAC if it has this property. If you consistency violations, you can never get away with it. You're always going to be harmed. And moreover, you're harmed in a targeted way without there being collateral damage to other people who are not attackers. Okay? So that's our articulation of what the sort of promise of slashing and proof of stake has always been. The results then concern when, if ever, can you have protocols that provably achieve this property. Okay? So we can visualize the results in the paper in terms of this lattice. So basically, the point of this paper was to identify this horizontal dotted line here. Okay? So assumptions are going from weak to strong, okay, as we go from the top of the slide to the bottom of the slide. So we're going to be flipping from negative results with weak assumptions to positive results with strong assumptions. The question is exactly when does that happen? Okay. And we're going to have two orthogonal types of assumptions that we're going to vary independently. So in principle, there's sort of 4 different settings, 3 of which it's impossible, 1 of which it's possible. So one of the axes that will vary is a very traditional one in consensus protocols, which is just around the timing, or equivalently around the reliability of the communication. Okay, so dating back to the early 80s, there's been a focus on, among other models, the synchronous model, which means that all of the validators, right, all the validators running the blockchain protocol, communicating over a network, maybe it's the internet or whatever. In the synchronous model, you're assuming that the internet's having a good day, that every message that anyone ever sends arrives on time. Meaning within some known bound, call it 2 seconds, something like that. That's the synchronous timing model. That's the easy scenario, easier for positive results. The more challenging timing model that we will look at is known as the partially synchronous model, which basically means there may be denial of service attacks of finite duration. So the network will sometimes be operating normally, messages all being delivered within 2 seconds, but sometimes there will be a period where there's no guarantees at all about message delivery. And those periods will end eventually, but you do not know a priori how long those periods of unreliability are going to last. So that's what I mean by the partially synchronous model. That is the more challenging timing model. And there's the traditional axis along which you study different consensus protocols. The second axis is new, relatively, and it was just formalized in a paper with one of my co-authors, Andy Lewis-Pye, about 2 years ago, a paper called Permissionless Consensus. And the challenge that arises in permissionless consensus protocol design, which we do not historically have from 20th century protocols, is the idea that non-malicious players may be periodically inactive or offline. Okay? Like if you think about the Bitcoin protocol, you could imagine, you're a Bitcoin miner, you're running the protocol. You go away for the weekend and you just like turn off your machines and then come back on Monday morning and turn on your machines again. Okay? You're not faulty or malicious. You just turned off the machines over the weekend. Otherwise, you're doing everything honestly. Probably many of you have the intuition that Bitcoin could care less. Bitcoin's going to be like totally fine. As long as at any given moment in time of the participating hash rate at that moment in time, as long as 51% of it is honest, it's all good. Okay? And that's correct. You can prove that about the Bitcoin protocol. Okay. So this is the second axis. Whether or not we allow non-malicious players to be periodically inactive, or whether we insist that they're always running the protocol correctly. Okay? So here, and again, this is relatively new language. So dynamically available means you allow honest players to turn off their machines for the weekends. Okay, we insist that the protocol continue to function, continue to be consistent and live, even with people going away periodically, as long as at any given moment in time, enough of the participation is honest. That means you function in the dynamically available setting. That is the more challenging setting for positive results. The stronger assumption, so the easier setting for positive results, would be the quasi-permissionless setting, which just says, look, if you're honest, that by definition is going to mean you're online running the protocol. Okay? So that's quasi-permissionless. Right? And so basically what the results say is that the 2 stronger assumptions are both necessary and sufficient for the EAC property, or if you want to think about it as provable slashing guarantees. Okay? So impossibility result number one says that if you insist that your protocol function correctly, even with fluctuating honest participation, with people going away for the weekend, if you insist on consistency and liveness, even in a dynamically available setting, you provably cannot also have the EAC property. Negative result number one. Negative result number two says, okay, I'll allow you to be, and that's true even in the synchronous setting, I should say. So in the first result, we make our lives easy in one way, reliable communication network. We show that's not enough. We have fluctuating participation. You can't have provable slashing guarantees. In the second impossibility result, we make our life easy in the other dimension. We say, okay. So let's just insist that honest means you're always online. You're always running the protocol. But we're going to allow an unreliable communication network, the partially synchronous setting. There again, you cannot have the EAC property. If you're consistent and live in the partially synchronous setting, you cannot also have the EAC property. Okay? On the other hand, if in fact you are in the synchronous setting, so there's some known bound on how long it takes any two parties to communicate, and it's the quasi-permissionless setting, meaning honest players by definition are always online, then in fact we give a protocol. It's not exactly the Ethereum protocol, but it resembles it in many design aspects. In particular, it's a proof of stake protocol with slashing. We give a protocol that if these assumptions are satisfied, then in fact you get provable slashing guarantees in the form of the EAC property. Okay, so in particular, anyone who causes a consistency violation is guaranteed to lose stake, and no honest player under any circumstances will ever lose stake. Okay, so that's the lattice of the results. And then the last slide is going to be interpretations of these results, because these actually ex post justify a lot of design decisions made in various blockchain protocols. In particular, let me focus on Ethereum. So our first impossibility result, that's the one that kind of says you can't have provable slashing guarantees in the dynamically available setting. People are allowed to go away for the weekend. That has actually a lot of implications. In particular, when people talk about the merge in 2022, mostly what people focus on is the switch from proof of work to proof of stake. A lot of other major changes were made at that same time. Probably the other most major change, okay, would be the addition of the finality gadget. Okay, so based on Casper. So there's still this kind of like longest chain sort of backbone in today's Ethereum, but there are also these checkpoints, okay, that get finalized periodically by a gadget which much more resembles the sort of 1980s PBFT style consensus protocols. Okay? So those, I would argue, perhaps the two biggest, at least conceptual, changes at the merge. Proof of work to proof of stake, from pure longest chain to the addition of a PBFT style finality gadget. Our first impossibility result implies in particular that neither of those changes alone would have been sufficient to get provable slashing guarantees. It was essential to actually make both of those major changes at the same time. If you stay pure longest chain, but switch to proof of stake, that's going to be a protocol that still operates properly in the dynamically available setting. And so our negative result will kick in. So you can't possibly have provable slashing guarantees. If you try to put in a finality gadget, but you stay with proof of work, then because proof of work is unobservable, you're in effect in the dynamically available setting. And again, our impossibility result kicks in. It says you can't have provable slashing guarantees. A third implication of the first impossibility result with respect to Ethereum, right? So it says you have to, like, if you want provable slashing guarantees, the honest players better be online all the time. Okay? So Ethereum has this little mechanism known as inactivity leaks. Okay? Probably the most well-known form of slashing in Ethereum is if you double vote. Okay, and that's kind of a smoking gun that at best you misconfigured your validator, and at worst you're trying to attack the protocol. Okay? So everyone knows double voting leads to slashing. But actually, if you're not participating, if you're missing slots where you're supposed to be proposing, if you're not voting, right, if the chain sort of stalls because not enough people are participating, you will actually also have some of your stake taken away from you. Okay, gradually, but it's taken away from you. Right? So what is that in hindsight? That is an economic mechanism to ensure that the assumptions of the quasi-permissionless setting indeed hold. That is an economic mechanism to ensure that anyone honestly running the protocol is not going to turn their machines off for the weekend. Okay? So in some sense, some kind of, if you want provable slashing guarantees, you need some way to make sure that people are online, and activity leaks being one way of doing that. So the second negative result, that's what says in partial synchrony, you can't have provable slashing guarantees. And actually, the argument of that result says something stronger that applies even to the synchronous model. Basically, what it says is that to have any hope of provable slashing guarantees, you need to have a cool down period, okay? By which I mean, you're staking, you're voting on stuff, you're participating in consensus. At some point, you want to get your assets out. So there's a process by which, you issue a transaction and say, hey, I want to stop validating and get back my assets. The cool down period is this period where you're no longer validating, but the protocol still has control over your stake, and in particular can slash you. Okay? So the cooldown period in Ethereum is rather long, order of days. And our second impossibility result actually says that it basically needs to be order of days. Okay? The precise statement is that the cooldown periods need to be at least as long as it takes parties to communicate and coordinate when the protocol is under attack. Okay? So for example, if the internet has gone down, people need to sort of somehow figure out, like call each other, to figure out that an attack is happening, order of days is probably about the right parameter value for that. Okay? So I would argue the second result justifies the long cooldown periods in Ethereum and other blockchain protocols as well. The interpretation of the third result, I think, is the obvious one, which is, for literally a decade, there's been the promise of asymmetric punishment due to proof of stake plus slashing, and this paper prevents the first protocol for which you can formally prove that that is in fact true. So, that's the presentation.
Thank you, Tim. So now you've heard a lot from me, from Tim. I want to turn to Katya and Katrin and start by asking you first what your reactions to the paper. It's not just this presentation, you did read this paper before. What do you appreciate the most, and what are still the issues that you are concerned about? Katya, let us start with you.
Sure. So I have to say, the first time, like Hanna said, I've been on panels, I've been a discussant. I have not been a panelist discussant, and neither the panelist nor discussant for computer science paper. So, but when I read this, to me, it seems that the desired condition for the protocol is actually very strong. Basically, we're not requiring neither type 1 nor type 2 errors. It has to be the case that if you committed the crime, if we see the crime committed, we can find the penetrator of the crime, and we can be guaranteed to punish that penetrator without any collateral damage. So nobody innocent is going to be punished. So if you think about it for the society, for any game theoretic setting, it's extremely strong assumption. So when I first read it, I was kind of expecting the impossibility results. So I think the most fascinating part about the paper that I find is that there is actually a possibility result, that such a protocol does exist under certain conditions. But that thought sort of brings me to a different thought process, which is when I'm reading it, it seems that the authors have defined the condition by basically defining the punishment. And then we're asking under which circumstances will this punishment work and result in sort of sustaining our coordination. Whereas coming from the game theory perspective, I'm used to sort of a slightly different perspective where here is the environment that we're in, and then can we design a punishment and rewards, but probably a punishment in a way that we can sustain something within the environment that we're given. And there is a large literature in game theory on folk theorems with perfect monitoring, imperfect monitoring, imperfect public monitoring, incomplete private information, and so on. And so a lot of it has to do with, and much of it comes to the conclusion that when when agents are sufficiently patient and value the future sufficiently highly, you can sustain a large variety of outcomes by designing sort of types of punishments. And I sort of, and not for this paper, actually, I really like the paper, but I'm sort of curious, what's the connection to the computer science and maybe particularly the not the quasi permissionless, the synchronicity assumption. I thought it's a very strong setting that we actually require the setting to be synchronous for the possibility results. And part of this game theory results is that sometimes you want to allow for some like gradual punishments and maybe leniency. So in the event you hit the innocent person, you like have a punishment for a short time, or you're lenient, you don't punish them the first time, or you have a gradual punishment, so you increase the punishment when there is a more and more violation. I'm wondering kind of if there's any connection, if maybe if you thought for any other projects or anybody else in computer science of sort of a reverse approach of take the setting which is the most likely in practice, and then try to design a punishment, including the slashing conditions, such that that would work. So that's my kind of thought process and comments.
I think maybe Tim, you can take it on if you have an answer.
Sure, sure. No, thanks for the comments. Yeah, maybe there are three different things I wanted to say. Let's see if I can remember them all. So maybe just one quick thing. You've given me very conveniently an excuse to elaborate on the positive result a little bit, which I simplified just to keep it short. So I talked about how it needs to be in the synchronous model. And that's true, but actually the way we do it is we have a synchronous model with two parameters. So we've got a delta 1 and a delta 2, and the idea is that sort of delta 1 is the 2 seconds I mentioned. So delta 1 is how fast it takes for messages to be delivered under normal circumstances, and then delta 2 is when it's not normal circumstances, how long it takes people to communicate, possibly not even over the network, possibly just over social media or whatever other coordination device that you have. And so for us, delta 1 would be like 2 seconds, and delta 2 would be like maybe 2 days or something like that. And then what you get is that if you're not under attack, you're going to have transactions processed on order of delta 1, order of seconds. And if you're under attack, you're going to have punishment and recovery at the order of delta 2, at the order of days. So it's only under sort of very exceptional circumstances you'll need to resort to that second delta 2. So it's not, the partially synchronous model is still more demanding, and that there is no delta 2. If maybe it takes weeks, maybe it takes months, like there's no bound on how long it takes to communicate, and so the impossibility result holds. But I actually think from a practical perspective, the version of synchrony that we use maps actually quite directly onto sort of how practitioners think about their blockchain protocols. So that was one thing. With respect to kind of the game theory connection, yeah, I mean, it's sort of, in a way, there's, I'd say, deceptively little economics per se in this paper. Right? It's there in the title. And there's no question, like, the EAC property, we are talking about people's, utility functions, like either going down or not going down. So it is sort of there in a sense, but I mean, one thing we were careful not to do was to actually try to reason. We're not trying to reason about whether or not an attacker would attack. Okay, so we do not have some kind of proposed utility function for the attacker. It's just kind of much more matter of fact. We don't know what they're going to do, but if they do this, this is what's going to happen to them, right? And maybe it's worth it. Maybe they're fine losing like 100,000 ETH, right, to do this attack, to get double spend and get a Lamborghini. It seems crazy, but maybe they are. So
the other guys in the network, do they have utility functions? Do they have strategies? Do they maximize something? Are you looking for a national program?
Yeah, so no, so we do not microfound the behavior of either. So it's very much a consensus paper in this sense, that there are sort of honest players and there are Byzantine players, and we microfound neither of them. Now, I mean, in practice, there are things like inflationary rewards, which you are given, right? And which, if you don't play along, you will forego. So even if you don't attack the protocol, if you don't do your job, you're not going to be getting those rewards. So it's not, you can certainly imagine zooming out and microfounding it. I think at the very least, that's a nice exercise. I don't know if that's a research paper, but that's kind of where that would be. So that was very deliberate.
Honest nodes basically just keep their client going on default setting.
That's right. So you download the reference client, you send it going. If your machine crashes, you reboot it. If you max out your bandwidth, you call your ISP and you get more bandwidth. Those are the things you're supposed to do as an honest node. Exactly. Yeah. And they keep their hardware sufficiently powerful that they can do it.
You do not want, like, you do not analyze whether it makes sense for them to comply with the protocol or deviate from it.
Yeah, I mean, so you could imagine adding, I mean, so in practice, these protocols have rewards. And so, you could imagine some very simple game theory models where you would argue it's sort of the best response for them, right? So for example, maybe I have no personal idiosyncratic value of attacking Ethereum, like I don't personally gain from it, but I do enjoy having more ETH, right? And the ETH is sufficient to cover my operating costs, right? Then sort of trivially, it's the best response for me, to be honest. So you can do that. Again, I don't know that I've seen, and there are papers that have said, okay, an attacker, there's some value of an attack, and they do cost-benefit analysis. I frankly don't. Game theoretically, they tend to be pretty simplistic. Doesn't mean you shouldn't do them, but they're not. I don't know that they would. I don't know that anyone in this room would be like super impressed by the game theory analyses I have in mind that would justify it. But
That would be a question for Eric.
You certainly could do it.
You just assume them away.
Again, you could write down an analysis if you wanted to that would justify it, but I don't think people would find that part of the paper very interesting because it's very simple game theory. And then there was a third thing, but I've forgotten. So you move on.
If you happen to remember, please. In the meantime, we can ask Katrin to give her reaction.
Yeah, so I think that overall it is a very nice paper to read. I recommend it to everybody precisely because authors are really careful in defining the concepts that are kind of easy to confuse ex ante, being like, because it's partially synchronous, you think that is a realistic world, but actually the nuances are exactly as you were telling, like that it is okay to be called synchronous if, let's say, in a couple of days messages don't arrive. So actually thinking about it is maybe not so extreme assumption. And if you remember his talks, that's where things went particularly bad, because it's not only the fact that we can't make targeted punishments, like nothing was working in this world. So one would think that there is like a way around, like by just telling that there is like no need for the protocol to wait for some, or like we're gonna ignore the messages after some specific data. Otherwise, I think that what was like, I guess, not so surprising is like many of my reactions are potentially not that different from Katya's, because I was also first thinking that why do we want to have targeted punishments? Because like kind of simple game theoretical argument will go that we can punish everybody, but because if it is severe enough, it's never going to happen in equilibrium and we are fine. But then we can like think more that maybe that will make it less desirable to join as a validator, for example. So one could imagine a setting where it is ex ante better to join if the punishments are targeted. So like one can imagine a setting where this is a better feature of the system. And then taking one step further, then it was like this quasi-permissionless case was looking also quite strong, in my opinion, because in the model, honest players are not necessarily the ones that don't have any particularly bad incentives. It's like a dishonest player could be just somebody whose computer crashes. So then it's also a question whether it is socially desirable to punish somebody who is not only ill, but has their house taken away as well, in addition to being ill. Like, so not only they lose some revenues at the time they can't be active, but like worse things happen to them. And then again, like thinking about how it relates to the ex ante incentives to join. And the last thing that I wanted to bring up it is because paper has very clean way of separating like cases of totally permissionless up to permission, and it is all when the paper is concerned about like just like whether the IDs, I mean, yeah, what is observable about the IDs. While like in many realistic applications, we often think that in permission systems, there is less anonymity, right? Because like there is maybe a consortium, we know who they are. And then again, thinking of like, if he wants the system to be socially desirable, then maybe given all the difficulties, like the question is like, how much should we insist on the pseudonymity of validators? After all, they are doing in the systems simplest task possible, just recording transactions. And as we saw earlier today with the presentations around privacy, maybe there are many other more important privacy aspects to protect rather than the validation. And of course, again, cheap argument would go that we would have reputation costs and things like that if you know who the validators are, but maybe we don't want the system to be then like corruptible by some big actors. So my question is, would there be still something in between like to consider? So having many pseudonymous potential validators, but still maybe one or few kind of non-anonymous large players who are like particularly harshly punished if they are not honest in according to the definitions of the model.
Great. Okay. So I think again, I have three things, and actually one of them conveniently reminded me of one of my original three. So with respect to the asymmetric punishment, yeah, no, I find it intriguing that that struck both of you, because to me, it sort of sells itself as an improvement over the sort of scorched earth, right? I mean, like you could imagine an approach to crime where, like, if anyone commits a serious crime, we shoot all the citizens dead, right? And then say, well, at equilibrium, that never happened, so it's sort of fine. Right? Whereas, like, you know, so the point is like,
I think you summarize a lot of economic analysis here.
okay. So the point is you want to be robust to off equilibrium play. So this is related to my other comment that I'm not actually microfounding like the attacker, right? So I can't say that they won't do X at equilibrium, right? Like I'm just saying if they do X, this is what's going to happen. And of course, you could imagine a lot of formal game structures where then they wouldn't do X, but like that's not part of it. So the asymmetric punishment, I'd like to think if you can get it, it's obvious it's what you want. Now you brought up the you know, right, so Katya, you talked about it nice in terms of type 1 and type 2 errors, and then you also talked about it in terms of quasi-permissionless and sort of. So one thing to clarify is that in our protocol, in our paper, we do not slash for inactivity. It is true in the quasi-permissionless setting, you will be counted toward the set of dishonest validators, but that will not actually trigger a slashing event. So you're only slashed if in fact you're caught double voting on different, in which there's no sort of plausible explanation for. That's kind of a smoking gun. Now in Ethereum, as I mentioned, there are these.
So you do not assume it in your model, but you assume quasi-permissionless. So you assume that they are always active.
Yeah.
Right. So in a way, it implicitly is you're assuming it away, but the underlying way to make them always active is to punish them for inactivity. Right? So is it a fair answer here?
Yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, it's unclear, right? Because I mean, if you're having inflationary rewards and you forego your inflationary rewards for being inactive, which is very common. Like, so there's other major proof of stake blockchain protocols without slashing. They have rewards, but if you're offline, you know, your uptime has to be 90%, otherwise you don't get your rewards, right? And that I would think is also sufficient to basically get the quasi-permissionless setting. So no, it's not obvious to me that sort of inactivity leaks are necessary. Anyway, so inactivity leaks, well, so a couple of things. I would say in Ethereum in particular, both the slashing for double voting, how harsh that is depends on how many other people are double voting with you. And that's exactly sort of trying to get at this thing where you're like, oh, maybe someone just made a mistake. So if you're just like some random person that seemed to double vote for no reason, you get slashed, but a very small amount. If there's a big attack against the protocol, all those attackers get slashed a very large amount, because then it seems that's the heuristic the protocol uses for determining which case you're in. Similarly, the inactivity leaks, you're absolutely right. I mean, that's more of a like a liveness issue where there's just always ambiguity between whether you were really like not doing your job versus whether your communication network just kind of was terrible. So it is definitely possible you'll be honest with a poor communication network and get slashed, but I think that's a big reason why those slashing penalties are kind of very gradual, very small. So you won't lose all your stake for, I forget, it's like weeks basically until you lose everything. And then your last point, kind of around the validator set, I mean, that I think is a great question that I think I would love to see more, you know, this idea of this sort of, you know, at one extreme, you have like, you know, the old vision that like kind of Facebook was putting forth, where you just kind of have like 22 validators and everyone knows who they are, and there's all these reputations at stake. At the other extreme, you've got like Bitcoin and Ethereum, where validators can be anybody joining, leaving at all times. And just some way of thinking, like parameterizing between those two extremes in a nice way, and thinking about where you want to be on that spectrum, depending on what you're trying to achieve. with your blockchain protocol. It's something actually I think about a lot, but I really don't have anything very formal to say about it at this point. I think it's a great point.
So let me, before turning to the audience, let me,
Clarification question.
oh, clarification question, okay.
So because we had a bit of a conversation here, so because there's a lot of terms coming around which I'm not familiar with, and I'm sure other people are not familiar with. The quasi, what was it called?
Permissionless.
Quasi permissionless, and then dynamic to asynchronous. So it sounded, and I think it came out in some of the comments that Katrin and Katya were making, is that it's a relatively strict definition, right? So either you are always online, or if you're not always online, you're automatically asynchronous. Or is this on a scale? Is there a distribution of it? So how do I have to think about this? And the reason why I'm asking is because there are, say in knowledge, in game theory, there are results that if even the smallest possible uncertainty can lead to a breakdown of common knowledge, let's say, right? It's a very common result that we have. But you can get it arbitrarily close, even when there is possible miscommunications, right? And so the question here is essentially about the equilibrium. If it's a very stark equilibrium, it's one or the other, can you get arbitrarily close even under certain, restrictions? So that's kind of the bigger question.
That makes sense. Yeah, so I wouldn't phrase it as an equilibrium question, really, because the positive result, I mean, it's really just, here's the protocol, like the software everyone's going to run, and here's a discussion of whether the execution of that protocol has this property or not, right? Based on what happens, based on the timing around messages, and based on whether honest players are paying attention in a given moment. So it's really a question about, how brittle is the sort of result that this protocol has this desired property. That's how I'd frame it. And yeah, so let me just say one trivial thing already, which is one way to think about it in the quasi-permissionless, and one of the panelists said this nicely, one way to think about the quasi-permissionless case is just if there's somebody who has honest intent, but is not reliably online, they just count toward the malicious budget. So really so if you can tolerate like 1/3 sort of Byzantine players, that 1/3 needs to cover both the people who are not capable of being reliably online and the people that are trying to mess around with your protocol. So that's the trivial. So just out of the box, it covers that case. You could imagine doing a more detailed analysis of our protocol where you say, okay, suppose that people are online, 1 minus delta fraction of the time steps, and moreover, there isn't like severe correlation between the delta for different people. And I'm sure some version of it would go through. It would get messier, but you certainly could imagine adding some robustness checks. It's not like a phase transition where as soon as that one person is offline for sort of 1 second, everything goes haywire. Exactly, how robust is it? That would take some detailed calculations, which we haven't done.
So I will ask one last question, and then maybe we can open it for a couple of questions from the audience. So I do want to echo Katya's and Katrin's statements about the asymmetric punishment, and not because it's not desirable. It's clearly desirable. Like, it's easy to sell property. However, in real life, we do not have many situations where there are no type 1, type 2 errors, and you can really implement it. We have law system where we try to punish the perpetrators, but the court system also shows how difficult it is to prove it one way or the other, and so on. So what you were arguing, the last slide, is that Ethereum in the current version of Ethereum really is providing this environment, which you think it's pretty amazing that we arrived at it. At the same time, it seems to me that this is the Ethereum, the stated protocol of Ethereum. And I want to ask you, what about the practical implementation with the centralization dynamics, with possible ways in which maybe the stated protocol may be misimplemented or misused? Do you think that it is robust to those forces?
Yeah, it's an interesting point. There's some aspects of this are easier than real life in that it's just pure software, right? And there's a notion of having a predicate, which is either 0 or 1, that's agreed upon, and a given sort of sequence of bits will either satisfy it or not, right? So if you believe in cryptography and the people sort of can't forge signatures, right? And you see signatures by the same block proposer in the same time slot of 2 different blocks, right? there's nothing to argue about really at that point, which again is different than So it's sort of this court of law where you like literally magically know what happened, as opposed to the ambiguity in any real life court case about like what actually happened. So
If the adversary holds majority of the stake, they cannot reverse the slashing decision.
so that is handled in the paper. So like another thing I didn't mention actually is that there is a limit to the third theorem, the positive result. So you can carry out asymmetric punishments if the adversary controls less than 2/3 of the stake. And if you think about it, like an adversary that controls 100% of the stake, right, there's literally nothing you can do, right? They literally just have unilateral control over the blockchain. So if you think about it for a second, you realize there's going to be some threshold beyond which you're not going to be able to do this no matter what other assumptions you make. Now, the 2/3 is sort of not sort of set in stone in the sense that you can actually relax your liveness requirements and actually get EAC at even higher thresholds. So with a normal parameterization, you would say, an Ethereum-like protocol should be live even with 33% Byzantine stake. And if you assert that, then you cannot get the EAC property above 67% Byzantine stake. But if you allow yourself to stall already with an adversary with 20% Byzantine stake, okay, so you make yourself less robust to liveness failures, then actually you can get the EAC property all the way up to 80%. And I've had some conversations with Vitalik actually that this may be a sort of preferable parameterization to the way the Ethereum works now. To be discussed, but that's that part of the design space is actually interesting, right? Because stalling is maybe not that big a deal if you can sort of get back on line really reasonably quickly, but maybe these consistency violations is a bigger deal, and you're willing to be more secure against consistency violations, giving up some of your liveness resilience in exchange.
So let me open it up for questions from the audience.
I have a clarifying question. Maybe it's not even related. I'll just ask anyways. Is there a notion of the severity of the attack and punishment sort of parameterized relative to the severity of the offense here? Like, is it related to how much was double spended, or was just like one punishment and that's it?
All right. So the amount that was double spent is unobservable by the protocol on some level. Like you again probably rip someone off for a Lamborghini or something like that. So that I don't even know how you'd go about doing that exactly. It's hard to know like you see a consistency, like this consistency violation can be seen by the protocol. The value of that consistency violation to the attacker, it's hard to know what.
Well, I guess my question is like this statement about attacker guaranteed to lose resources. Is it net of the gain on the offense or just lose stake?
Yeah, no, there's no way for the protocol to know the gain from the offense.
Got it.
That's just unobservable. You can have it parameterized by other things, and like I said, Ethereum does, right? So like how much you lose, how much you get slashed for double voting depends on how many other people double voted with you. Our protocol does not do that. Our protocol is kind of, we just wanted it as simple as possible, subject to meeting this property. So in ours, if you double vote, you lose everything.
Is it correct to assume that your synchronicity assumption applies uniformly to the whole network at the time when you go from Delta 1 to Delta 2? It applies to everybody on the network at that time? Because otherwise, you see the inactivity, if some part is inactive, maybe it's because they are in Delta 2.
Let me think for a second. So, yeah, so they do interact with each other, right? So like, in effect, and this is again true for the 1980s models also, if you're assuming you're in the synchronous model with sort of maximum delay delta, but then in the execution, something's violated and it takes more than delta, that kind of plays the role as if that was actually a Byzantine node that got it within delta, but then waited to respond. So you're correct to say that when you say you're in the synchronous model with parameter delta, by default, you say, yes, that's for all the messages. There's been a lot of ways of proposed how to parameterize that. Maybe some of the links are synchronous and some of the links are partially synchronous. There's a big literature on that. But in the basic model, yeah, you would just say worst case message delay is delta.
Unfortunately, we're out of time. So join me thanking the panelists for a nice presentation.